Have you ever heard of an empire, a superpower of its time, that just vanished? I'm not talking about a slow decline. I'm talking about a civilization that was at the top of its game one moment, and then, poof, gone from the history books for 3,000 years. Today, we re-diving into one of the greatest mysteries of the ancient world, the sudden and catastrophic collapse of the mighty Hittite Empire. For centuries, the Hittites were a force to be reckoned with. They rose from the rugged highlands of Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, around 1650 BC. These weren't just some local tribe. They were innovators, warriors, and diplomats who built an empire that rivaled ancient Egypt and Babylon. They were masters of iron, forging weapons that were stronger and sharper than the bronze ones used by their enemies. This technological edge gave them a massive advantage on the battlefield. Their capital, Hattusa, was a fortress city, protected by massive stone walls that were considered impenetrable. Inside, they developed a complex society with a unique legal system that was surprisingly progressive for its time. Unlike the brutal, eye for an eye laws of their neighbors, Hittite law often favored restitution over retribution. If you stole a cow, you didn't lose a hand. You had to pay back its value, plus a fine. They were also pioneers in international relations. The Hittites signed the world's first known peace treaty, the Treaty of Kadesh, with the Egyptian pharaoh Ramesses the Great. This wasn't a treaty signed out of weakness. It came after a colossal battle between the two superpowers, a battle so epic that both sides claimed victory. The treaty established borders, promised mutual defense, and was sealed by a royal marriage. A copy of this ancient cuneiform tablet is even displayed at the United Nations headquarters in New York today, a testament to its historical significance. So, you have this powerful, advanced, and stable empire. They controlled vast territories, commanded powerful armies, and engaged in sophisticated diplomacy. And then, around 1200 BC, the lights went out. The entire civilization collapsed with shocking speed. Their grand cities, including the mighty Hattusa, were violently destroyed and abandoned. Their writing system, a unique cuneiform script, disappeared. Their language fell silent. It was so total, so absolute, that for thousands of years, the Hittites were little more than a footnote, a mysterious people mentioned a few times in the Old Testament. It wasn't until the late 19th and early 20th centuries that archaeologists, digging in the soil of Turkey, rediscovered the lost city of Hattusa and began to piece together the story of this forgotten empire. This brings us to the big question: what happened? How could a civilization this powerful just disappear off the face of the earth? This isn't a simple case of one kingdom conquering another. This was a systemic collapse, a regional apocalypse that historians call the Late Bronze Age collapse. And the Hittites were at the epicenter of it. For decades, scholars have debated the cause, pointing to a mysterious group of invaders known only as the Sea Peoples. Who were the Sea Peoples? That's another giant mystery. Egyptian records describe them as a confederation of seafaring raiders who came from the north, from the islands in the midst of the sea. They swept down the coast of the eastern Mediterranean, leaving a trail of destruction in their wake. They toppled kingdoms, sacked cities, and threw the entire ancient world into chaos. The Egyptians, under Pharaoh Ramesses III, barely managed to fight them off, but the Hittites weren't so lucky. Inscriptions tell us the Hittite king pleaded for aid, stating that his country was being burned and his armies were scattered. But no help came. The Sea Peoples were the perfect storm, a relentless wave that crashed against the shores of the Hittite Empire and washed it away. For a long time, the Sea Peoples were the primary suspects, the convenient villains who explained everything. But modern archaeology and climate science are telling us a more complex and fascinating story. It turns out, it probably wasn't just one thing that brought down the Hittites. It was more like a perfect storm of calamities, a series of dominoes falling one after the other. Let's start with the climate. Scientists have studied ancient tree rings from this period, and they found evidence of a severe and prolonged drought that lasted for decades, maybe even centuries. This wasn't just a dry summer. This was a fundamental shift in the climate that would have been devastating for an agricultural society like the Hittites. Less rain meant failed harvests. Failed harvests meant widespread famine. Imagine a kingdom where the granaries are empty and people are starving. The social fabric begins to tear apart. The king, who was seen as the intermediary with the gods responsible for ensuring prosperity, would have lost his authority. People would have been desperate. This leads us to the next domino: internal rebellion. When people are hungry and desperate, they don't just sit and wait to die. They rise up. Letters found in the Hittite archives paint a picture of a kingdom in turmoil. There are reports of grain shortages, pleas for food shipments from Egypt, and mentions of uprisings in the provinces. It's likely that the centralized power of the Hittite king crumbled as local regions, struggling to feed their own people, broke away. The empire was rotting from within. A starving population and a fractured government make for a very weak state. Now, add disease to this horrifying mix. Famine and malnutrition weaken the immune system, making populations incredibly vulnerable to epidemics. While we don't have direct proof of a specific plague, it's a common pattern throughout history. A widespread pandemic sweeping through a starving and disorganized population would have been the stuff of nightmares, further crippling the empire's ability to function or defend itself. So, picture the scene. The Hittite Empire is on its knees. It's weakened by a catastrophic drought, torn apart by famine and internal revolts, and possibly ravaged by disease. And it's at this exact moment of maximum vulnerability that the Sea Peoples arrive. They weren't necessarily a massive, unified army. They could have been waves of migrants and raiders, themselves displaced by the same climate change and chaos affecting the rest of the region. They were desperate people on the move. But to the weakened Hittites, they were the final, fatal blow. They were the ones who kicked down the door of a house that was already collapsing. The capital, Hattusa, was burned to the ground. The destruction was so complete that the survivors scattered. They abandoned their cities and their way of life. The complex infrastructure of the empire, the trade routes, the bureaucracy, the scribal schools, all of it fell apart. Without a centralized state to support them, the knowledge of their unique cuneiform script was lost within a generation. The people who survived didn't disappear entirely, of course. They likely assimilated into other local cultures, their distinct Hittite identity fading into the mists of time. Small Neo-Hittite kingdoms did emerge later in parts of Syria and southern Anatolia, hanging on to fragments of Hittite culture for a few more centuries, but the great empire was gone forever. The story of the Hittites is a powerful and sobering reminder. It shows us that even the mightiest empires are fragile. It's a lesson that civilization is not a permanent state of being. It's a complex system that depends on a delicate balance of factors, including a stable climate, a reliable food supply, and social cohesion. When those pillars are kicked out, everything can come crashing down with terrifying speed. The Hittites weren't erased by a single enemy. They were victims of a cascading systems collapse, a perfect storm of climate change, famine, disease, and invasion. Their sudden disappearance from history serves as a chilling warning from the ancient world, a warning that is perhaps more relevant today than ever before. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive into one of history's greatest mysteries. If you enjoyed this, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next journey into the past. See you next time.